So, welcome once again, everyone, and good evening to those of us who are in the room. As the nights rolls by, I believe we'll have more and more people joining us. It's once again the monthly event of the Mentoring Research Network. It's a monthly webinar, and this month, which is the month of November, we happen to have the opportunity to also contribute to the antimicrobial resistance awareness. As you know, or some of you may be aware that this week is the World Antimicrobial Resistance Awareness Week for 2024, and the MRN being one of those growing bodies of researchers, career persons in the global south. We also find it very important to lend a voice to the joint, I wouldn't say outcry, but the joint call to action for humanitarian and human consciousness of the world in which we live, vis-a-vis the impact of antimicrobial resistance, not only on us as a species, but also on the other components of this ecosphere in which we find ourselves. My name is Samuel Abimbola, and it's a privilege that to be hosting this month's webinar. With me in the house is Iyiola Olaundjoe, a renowned and wonderful person. I'll leave the accolades and the introduction in details until just right before his presentation. But I'd like to just mention the name and let you know that it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from one of the most outstanding scholars Nigeria has to offer for this generation. We also have Yusuf Tajuddin already with us, who just recently completed his master's program. And like I mentioned just before, some of you will begin to join the room. I think we all need to go back to Nigeria to have another graduation ceremony where we can eat, wine, and dine and celebrate together. We also have Joe Payne with us this evening. Mr. Joe, good evening to you. It's a privilege. It's a wonderful opportunity to have you with us this evening. I hope you're enjoying the weather wherever you are.
Okay, so let's begin by the icebreaker. If Yola can share screen that.
Okay. So
Yola, can you check the sound? The sound is not coming across at this end.
okay.
I think you need to also share your sound.
Please let me know if the sound is coming.
Okay. Not yet.
Association presents
Yeah.
story of Zuba's fever.
Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Zuba. Zuba and her little siblings were taken care by her elder sister after her mother had died a few years back. They lived in the countryside in a small farm. One day, Zuba fell ill with high fever and vomiting. Her concerned sister asked help from the neighbors. A lady next door gave her a bottle of antibiotics, which was a leftover medicine. The lady had used it previously when her son was sick. However, Zuba's fever persisted and her condition became worse. Father became very worried for her. A wise friend advised him to show Zuba to a doctor in a nearby healthcare center. The doctor listened to the health complaints and carefully examined Zuba. Seeing that Zuba was dehydrated, he started her on a fluid drip and medicines to stop her vomiting and to reduce fever. he took some blood samples for testing. Zuba's test report suggested that she had a viral infection. The doctor told the father that she is better now. He needs to drink a lot of liquids and eat healthy food. He explained to the father that antibiotics kill bacteria and do not work against viruses. One should not use antibiotics for every fever, especially without seeking a doctor's advice. Never again, doctor. We'll always keep this in mind. Father replied gratefully. Moral of the story: every fever does not need an antibiotic for cure. Unnecessary use of antibiotics can be harmful. Issued in public interest for creating awareness about proper use of antibiotics by IPA.
Bonjour.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. That's a very, very, very nice one. When Dr. Mona shared it with me, I was so enthralled in the whole voiceover. I loved the voice of the child who actually read the script. That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that video there. And so we would move on to the agenda for this evening. First, I would like to invite Dr. Mona, if she's available, to give a brief overview of the Mentoring Research Network. Dr. Mona is the director of the Mentoring Research Network. She's also a lecturer at Cairo University. I would like Dr. Mona to say more about herself and also about the vision that actually gave birth to the Mentoring Research Network and some of the things we've been trying to accomplish in the last 2 years. Dr. Mona.
Thank you, Samuel. As Samuel mentioned, I'm a medical doctor, specifically specialized in parasitic infectious diseases, and an associate professor and founding director of narrative medicine and planetary health, where I'm trying to balance the hard science with the soft science and humanities. What's really important about today's topic, the antimicrobial resistance, that there is a pressing global need, and as we are witnessing also a socioeconomic crisis from the abuse and misuse of antimicrobials. So we need to discuss this with a context on Africa, and this will be after we introduce our dear colleague Iyiola. Samuel, if you can introduce Iyiola and his bio, and then we can proceed with the presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Mona. I think I'll just start off. I'll just start off with it will be very brief, a brief introduction about Iyiola. The funny thing is, every time I look around me, it looks like I still get to meet people. I get connected with people from University of Ilorin. Somehow, it just continues to, circle around me. Iyiola happens to have graduated from the University of Ilorin as a first-class graduate of the Department of Microbiology. And in the room this evening, I have a few other persons who have also passed through that department from the University of Ilorin, with whom we've shared quite a few crisscrosses along life's path. From his first degree in the University of Ilorin, he's gone on to take on his master's degrees in vaccinology as a part of the Erasmus Mundus Scholarship Program, graduating just in this year, 2024. He also received the prestigious 2024 ASM, that's the ASM Young Ambassador Excellence Award, and the 2023 Diana Award for contributing to microbial sciences and advocacy against antimicrobial resistance. As the ASM Young Ambassador to Nigeria from the year 2021 till 2023, he organized professional development workshops, established several student chapters for the ASM in Nigeria, empowered many, many young people to carry on the vision and the dream of establishing very well-grounded microbiologists who would continue to promote vaccine-based solutions to tackle global infectious diseases within the One Health framework. This is just a little bit an insight into the excellence of this young man. He is someone who, by and large, I've been able to interact with. And beyond science, he's also a very, very down-to-earth and humble person. So much so that when you meet him, you may not know that he is one of the most outstanding young scholars the University of Ilorin has had to produce from the Department of Microbiology in recent years. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I present to you Iyiola Olaundjoe, who will be taking us through this evening's webinar's presentation. The title of that event is Vaccines as a Core Strategy within the One Health approach to combat antimicrobial resistance. Iyiola, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so I'll be sharing my screen now, and I'll get started with the presentation. I believe my screen is showing right now.
Yes, the screen is sharing. Yeah.
Okay. So uh, as it was mentioned, today I'll be talking about vaccines as a core strategy within the One Health approach to combat antimicrobial resistance. And this is because of the World Antimicrobial Resistance Awareness Week, which holds from November 18 to 23rd, I believe, every year. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak about these topics, vaccines, One Health, and antimicrobial resistance, which are really the themes of my research and the things I find mostly passionate. So today's webinar objectives will be focused on exploring the role of vaccinology in combating AMR and also to understand the One Health approach. And I'll be discussing current research and innovations briefly. And also, it's also a platform for us to discuss these cross-disciplinary fields and also to raise awareness about AMR in Africa, obviously. So firstly, I would like to start from what is AMR. And AMR simply is when microbes evolve to become resistant to drugs, and these drugs can be antimicrobials. They can be antimicrobials in the broad context of things, but antimicrobials are antibiotics, antifungals, antiparasitic drugs, and also antivirals. And all of these are designed to kill microbes that they are designed for. For example, antibiotics to kill bacteria. And when these drugs do not work as they should, and it can also be, aside from being drugs or medications, it can also be topical creams, like, for example, many fungal creams that are used for skin infection, for example. When they stop working and when they stop killing these microbes that they are designed to kill, this is when antimicrobial resistance is said to happen. And the problem with antimicrobial resistance is that based on recent statistics, it leads to about 4.9 million deaths annually. And it also causes, there are also 1.27 million deaths that are directly from antibiotic resistant bacteria. And who is at risk of this? Everyone is simply at risk, all of us, including young, the elderly, the individual, especially people that have weakened immune system, immunocompromised patients or immunosuppressed individuals. And how does AMR occur? Simply, it occurs, and I have a picture here showing how it occurs, and I'll briefly describe it. So usually, microorganisms or bacteria are meant to be sensitive to these drugs that are designed to kill them. And when we have sensitive strain of these bacteria, for example, there are some that will mutate. And when they mutate, and this is due to selective pressure, then they are able to withstand the effect of the antibiotics. And then the ones that are sensitive will then die, but the mutated bacteria would survive. And because bacteria have the ability to, multiply rapidly, these resistant strain then starts to multiply. And bacteria don't just have the ability to multiply rapidly, but they have the ability to share their genetic information amongst themselves, especially through the use of plasmids. And when this happens, we now have a group of bacteria that are drug resistant. And this is just a schematics of how it works. And the risk of this happening is that if left unchecked, by 2050, 10 million annual deaths would be attributed to antimicrobial resistance. And the financial cost, according to World Bank, is estimated to be 100 trillion worldwide. So this is one of the biggest global health issues we are currently facing in the 21st century. And I'd just like to briefly describe the timeline of AMR as we know it and brief history of antimicrobials. So firstly, the early discoveries of antibiotics, as we know, starts with penicillin. But even before the discovery of penicillin by Sir Alexander Fleming, there was an arsenic based antimicrobial, which was called Savastan, developed by Paul Ehrlich. And this was used in the treatment of syphilis as early as 1910. But there were issues with this treatment. It was highly toxic. And it was the first magic bullet that we had that could combat infectious disease effectively. But penicillin came, which was a fungal-based antibiotic, especially around 1928. And then just shortly after penicillin, in fact, during the Nobel speech of Sir Alexander Fleming, he mentioned the possibility of resistance. And this phenomenon, it didn't take time before, resistance started happening. And as early as 1947, we had an outbreak of penicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus on a global scale. And we had a golden era of antibiotics. We had antibiotics save millions of lives from 1940 to 1970. But then we started having complex issues with resistance with the emergence of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And this resistance started growing from 1970s till 2000. And then that left us with the modern challenge that we have now. We now have different kind of resistance in bacteria. For example, in tuberculosis, we have MDR tuberculosis, extensive drug resistance tuberculosis. We have almost all the antibiotics that have been discovered are not working. The bacteria that they were designed to kill are now becoming resistant to these antibiotics. So we have a risk at hand. And there have been a lot of global efforts to tackle this risk. And so many tools, emerging tools and techniques to also combat antibiotic resistance, apart from the fact that we are still in the race to discover new antimicrobials, especially because the effectiveness of what we have currently is dwindling. And I would also just like to discuss what life would be without antimicrobials in the past and also now. So before penicillin, common infection that we have the capacity to treat, like pneumonia and tuberculosis, were very fatal. And simple ones, for example, like I go play football and I have a scratch in my leg, could lead to deadly infections before the advent of penicillin, and childbirth often leads to maternal and infant deaths due to infection. And after penicillin, this revolutionized medicine, and it's even enabled modern treatments as well. It's enabled cancer therapy because cancer patients who are often immunocompromised are susceptible to secondary bacterial infections. So with the advent of antimicrobials, they could, be able to get treatment for this, and also organ transplants and complex surgeries. And now that we are now getting into the pre-antibiotic era, which many scientists called post-antibiotic era, we can start having the risk of, life-threatening conditions as a result of minor injuries. And so many medical procedures might become difficult to combat. And also there will be a rise in healthcare costs. And this highlights one of the significance of these problems. And so many organizations, for example, the Infectious Disease Society of America, have started, publishing several patient stories on what they faced as a result of antimicrobial resistance. And these stories are very touching, the Telegraph also reported several women that were living with drug-resistant infections and how it changed their life. And one thing that is significant here is that we usually call AMR silent pandemic, but the global threat of AMR is no longer silent. It is here with us now and is affecting people in real time. And this is also another news that shows how amputees, that is people that, became amputees due to infectious disease infections that are very difficult to treat, are giving their voice to AMR as well. And when we talk about antimicrobial resistance, one of the most effective approach in tackling AMR is One Health approach. And I'll briefly like to tell us what One Health is all about. So One Health is basically when fields in environmental health, animal health, and human health come together, and according to CDC, right, professionals or people in these fields come together, they coordinate together, they communicate together, they collaborate together to achieve best health outcomes for people, animals, plants, and our shared environments. So it's a collaborative, multi-sectoral, and transdisciplinary approach to tackle issues such as antimicrobial resistance, and it's requires work across multiple levels, across local, regional, national, and global levels. And the aim is to achieve optimal outcome. And it also recognizes that our health is interconnected and intertwined. That is, human health is connected to animal health, and that's connected to environment as well. And I have this picture showing the history of One Health across board, how, for example, in 1980, we had a pandemic caused by Spanish flu, which killed 50 million people, as well as several evidence that most of the diseases that we've come about, for example, arboviral diseases, are from animals, and as a result of environmental changes as well. And so many, diseases that are still very, very dangerous today, like Ebola, HIV/AIDS, Endra, Nipah, SARS, MERS, and most recently, SARS-CoV-2, which caused COVID-19, as zoonotic infectious diseases. So that shows the interconnectedness between these fields. And when we talk about One Health, it's not just tackling the issue of antimicrobial resistance, but it's also looking at other aspects like climate change, water pollution, air pollution, biodiversity loss, which also impacts how, antimicrobial resistance spread as well. So the World Health Organization, has recognized One Health as the main approach considered for tackling today's complex health challenges. And as I mentioned, to tackle ecosystem degradation, address food system failures, curb infectious disease, and most especially combat antimicrobial resistance. And I would like to discuss the importance of One Health in AMR research. Firstly, we should know that lots of the diseases that I mentioned earlier, 60% of existing infectious diseases are zoonotic, and 75% of emerging diseases in humans are of animal origin. And 5 new human diseases appear every year, and 3 are of animal origin. And 80% of these agents have that are used for the potential bioterrorist agents or zoonotic pathogens. And another news that I saw from the University of Oxford is that an estimated 1.2 million people died in 2019 as a result of antibiotic-resistant infection. And when we look at issues that lead to spread of diseases, one of the major issues, which we even face most recently in Nigeria, is flooding. And when flood happens, it's not just about the impact on the environment, that the environment is flooded, but it also leads to spread of waterborne diseases like cholera, leptospirosis, giardia, and these diseases often require the use of antimicrobials. And I would just like to briefly share my research and experience from the University of Ilorin with regards to how I got to know about antimicrobial resistance and how that connects to One Health as well. So this was me when I was doing my student industrial work experience scheme in 2017 at the Veterinary Teaching Hospital, University of Ilorin. And this plate which I got online showed one of the phenomena that I experienced when during my experience at the Veterinary Teaching Hospital, especially with regards to diagnosis of drug-resistant pathogens in animals. So what I observed is that when pet owners or farmers bring their animals to the hospital, the veterinarians collect relevant samples to diagnose their disease. So it could be wound swabs, it could be vaginal swabs from dogs, it could be, post-mortem samples like liver of poultry birds, just to know what has really led to like severe economic loss in different poultry farms. And when we have these animals, when we have these various clinical samples from animals, we isolate the bacteria from them. And most importantly, we try to identify these bacteria using different techniques. And what we actually do to inform the advice the veterinarian will give the pet owners or farmers is antimicrobial susceptibility testing. And then we realize that, many of these antimicrobials, of which sounded really familiar to me because they are also useful in human health, were becoming, resistant. Many of these, bacterial pathogens were becoming resistant to, the conventional antibiotics. And this can be typified from what I have on the screen. From what I have on the screen, we could see that there were zone of inhibitions, for various antibiotics disc, and then this is becoming becoming resistant. That is, the bacteria could grow in the presence of the antibiotics, and this is a risk that I observed. And I wanted to understand this properly, so I decided to carry out a research that would enable me to understand how this happens across the One Health approach. Because when I read about AMR, the first thing I saw in effectively tackling it was One Health. So I'm drawing these schematics, or I'm showing these schematics to explain my research briefly, and I'll still go in detail. So what happens basically is that in public abattoirs in Nigeria, right, many of their processes are done near streams and water bodies. And what they do is that these animals, of which were grown using antibiotics as growth promoters, without any check and balance, the livestock farmers have used lots of antibiotics for these animals, and then their waste are being discharged to the streams. They have sewer lines connecting directly to these streams, and then most of them are in rural areas where people would in fact, in that environment, you could see people using the water already for domestic use, because they were even using it to farm, because they felt like this was a very rich source of manure. And then the water flows to other parts where perhaps they don't have access to quality water treatments, and these wastewater are not even treated before they are discharging it. So people then get contaminated with waterborne diseases. They get contaminated with microorganisms that lead to waterborne diseases. And they are often not just microorganisms that like cholera and typhoid that could cause waterborne diseases, but that are potentially, resistant to antibiotics. So I carried out this study at the University of Ilorin, and it was one of the first studies to assess the epidemiological implications of wastewater from abattoirs. And I could see that this was done in other states, Nigerian states, but not University of Ilorin at that time. And this was 2018. So I sampled for major public abattoirs over 2 time periods in January and March 2018. And the aim of my project was just to analyze this abattoir wastewater and also to characterize bacteria isolate and identify them, then test their antibiotic resistance and impact on plasmid curing on bacteria. So what I did was, this was a schematic of the work I did, get the wastewater sample, carry out serial dilution, do microbial culturing and incubate. I was able to identify that, all my sampling sites basically had growth of bacteria and coliform counts. But what was most significant was that I was also able to identify that they had presence of fecal coliforms, such as E. coli and enterococci. And these signify that there is a consistent and persistent, fecal contamination in this wastewater, obviously. But the risk of this is that people then get down with a lot of waterborne diseases, not just bacterial disease, but parasitic disease as well, because there are coliforms in the water that they are discharging this wastewater to. So, and getting these samples from the sewer line that is going directly to water sources is risky. So, to identify my bacterial species, I used biochemical tests. And I also did molecular techniques as well. Did gel electrophoresis and also blasted my sequences on NCBI database to identify these bacterial species, mostly which were pathogenic bacteria like E. coli, Pseudomonas, Salmonella, and Shigella. And after getting my pure isolates, I conducted, antibiotic susceptibility testing using the Kepler method, that's the agar disk diffusion method. And then after doing this, I realized that many of my isolates were actually resistant to conventional antibiotics. But I was very curious to understand if this resistance was born on their plasmids or on their chromosome. So I decided to do something called plasmid curing. So plasmid are extrachromosomal materials that bacterial species can use to share several genetic information, including resistance factors among themselves. So I did a chemical curing using acridine orange solution. And the result I was able to obtain was actually mind-blowing, and I would explain. So I was able to detect the multiple antibiotic resistance index, that is, and it varies from 0 to 1. So 0 means that the bacteria was susceptible to all the antibiotics, and 1 means resistant. And what was funny was that, for example, we had this Vibrio species that was, resistant to all the antibiotics before plasmid curing, now became, 0 after plasmid curing, which suggested that, the various shifts that we had, and for some species like the Proteus vulgaris, they didn't change. But what we could identify from this study was that the bacteria were sharing plasmids among themselves, and that plasmid, was actually one of the reasons why many of the bacterial species were resistant to conventional antibiotics. And this study, this simple study, just showed, the risk of antimicrobial resistance across human animal health, firstly, to environmental, spread, and also how it could potentially affect human health as well. So I hope I've been able to explain that AMR is a One Health issue, and these are the state of public abattoirs in Nigeria. And it's of no surprise that, every year we hear reports of epidemics and, issues such as Nigeria facing these epidemics as a result of lack of access to safe water. And every year there's always a report on cholera. So Nigeria is endemic to cholera, which is quite baffling and sad for in the 21st century. And some of the inference from this study, is that abattoir wastewater in Ilorin has high bacterial load. So there's a need to effectively treat these wastewater before discharging them and even valorize them. They could use them, for generation of, biofuels or biogas. These are also one of the frontiers of effectively managing waste. And the presence of antibiotic resistant bacteria also could lead to, colonization of human population, and that could lead to potential public health concerns. And this emphasizes that we need to upgrade how we manage waste and how we operate abattoirs in Nigeria. And the results of this research has been published in a PubMed Index journal. And to tackle issues such as antibiotic resistance, over the years, there've been several, quadripartite One Health Joint Action Plan that has been carried out by supra-international organizations like FAO, UNEP, WHO, and also OIE, which is the World Organization for Animal Health. And this One Health Action Plan has been, trickled down to various countries, including Nigeria. Nigeria has a One Health strategic plan, although I think it needs an update because this is from 2019, 2023. And we also have a national action plan for AMR, which was recently updated. We have National Action Plan 2.0, where we've seen relevant ministries in agriculture and rural development, Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Health working together to actually delineate how to tackle antimicrobial resistance across all sectors. In my own opinion, I think there are still challenges with implementing some of the recommendations in this action plan in Nigeria. And talking about this action plan, I would just like to talk about recent research and approaches to tackle AMR as well. So because of the complexity of AMR and because of the fact that antimicrobial resistance cannot be successfully tackled by, looking for antimicrobials, which have been challenging over the past decade. Getting new antimicrobials have been very, very challenging because there's really no economic incentives for researchers or big pharmas to commercialize new antimicrobials and it's just because of the obvious fact that it's not just the misuse and overuse of antimicrobials that leads to resistance. The mere usage of antimicrobials would definitely lead to resistance. So scientists have been thinking of new ways to then tackle this problem. And one of those ways is the use of antimicrobial peptides, which are charged peptides with high affinity towards vital bacterial targets. We also have host-directed therapy. We have antivirulence drugs, which are designed to combat the virulence of pathogens, which also, complicates infections. We have phage therapy, which has been very promising. We have the Cas9 antimicrobials as well. We have live biotherapeutic, and the focus of today, we have vaccination, which prepares the host body to tackle pathogens through immunization against pathogens of interest. And talking about vaccines as a One Health approach to tackling AMR, this has been, been pushed by several organizations like Gavi. It's one of the, based on my own strong opinion, the most sustainable ways to tackle antimicrobial resistance. And in fact, WHO mentioned that better use of vaccines could reduce antibiotic use by 2.5 billion doses annually. So if we could reduce this number of usage annually, that means that we could actually turn down the effect of antimicrobial resistance as well, and even save money from treating resistant infection. But what if we could also potentially discover new, vaccines for drug-resistant pathogens, especially bacterial pathogens? And I'd just like to tell us that, resistance vaccines rarely occur. So vaccine resistance is not a problem per se compared to, antimicrobial resistance. And this flow chart on the screen, from what we can observe, we have various antimicrobials like sulfonamide, streptomycin, penicillin, chloramphenicol. At a point in time, shortly after their introduction, we face resistance for these antibiotics. Like, in fact, most recent times, with the introduction of new antibiotics, resistance come in just as they are introduced. But when we look at vaccines, the reverse is the case. We've seen vaccines not just combating the disease they are designed to combat, but also eradicating it. We've actually seen a success story of smallpox as well. And even when we look at bacterial vaccines like DTaP against diphtheria and tetanus, we've seen that there is no issue of resistance. The only time when we can say resistance occur in vaccines would probably be due to the changes in serotypes of these viruses or bacteria that they are designed to. And we have these cases for pneumococcal vaccines where there are several serotypes, but the advantage of vaccines is that they can be modified to contain these serotypes, and that's why we have different vaccines against pneumonia like Prevnar 13, 15, 25. Scientists continue to update this to be able to combat the effect of different emerging serotypes that we have. So, and I would like to explain, why, we have, antibiotic resistance, but not vaccine resistance. So the way, drugs works, antibiotics work is that they bind to the binding sites, and then the target of the drug in the bacteria could change, could mutate rapidly. And when it changes, the drug cannot effectively bind to that target anymore. And that's why, the usage of the drug cannot really impact the treatment anymore. But in the case of vaccines, right, we have the vaccines such that the vaccines, when vaccines are used, they are used such that they stimulate, antibodies against the bacteria or the virus, the foreign pathogens. And what happens is that whether mutation occurs or not, these antibodies still have the ability to bind, and and provide protection. And we've seen the cases of this even with COVID-19, for example. COVID-19 strains were mutating rapidly, but scientists and public health advisors encourage that people should still get vaccinated, because even though the strains are changing, right, the mere vaccination, like the mere vaccination leads to stimulation of relevant immunological responses that could still prevent serious illnesses, even if infection occurs. So this is why this is one of the reasons that vaccination or vaccines are very relevant to combat AMR. And the difference between the way antibiotics and vaccines work is that vaccines train the body before infections happens. But by the time antibiotics are used to treat infection, infection has already occurred. because antibiotics are used to, treat infection when you observe that, a person has been colonized with a bacteria, and these bacteria have rapidly, multiplied, and this multiplication, this colonization also increase the chance of resistant mutation appearing. But reverse is the case in terms of vaccination, because vaccination has already prepared our, immune system against any infection. And then when these, bacterial, these foreign pathogens come into our body, the antibodies are stimulated, just have the ability to, stop the infection before mutations can even occur. So the WHO has a list of, bacteria that we should be looking at, which is called a global priority list for antibiotic resistance, to guide the discovery and development of new therapeutics against resistant pathogens. And these lists are classified into three. We have the medium, we have the critical list, we have the high and the medium. And several researches are being carried out, to tackle some of the bacteria, to develop vaccines to tackle them. I know there are currently vaccines in clinical trials against E. coli, and there are some other vaccines against other bacterial species. Yeah. So what I also want to mention is that we could potentially then have One Health vaccines. And what I mean by this is that vaccines that can act cross-species, not just, help to tackle diseases in humans, but also in animals, right? And we've seen evidence of this. There was this publication I saw where there are some diseases that affect humans and animals alike, and they have licensed, and scientists are trying to have licensed vaccines for both, because we have, for example, we have rabies, which affects animals, but could also potentially affect humans. And then we have diseases where we have vaccines, licensed vaccines available in both, humans and animals. And researches are being carried out against not just viral disease, but also tuberculosis, to have vaccines not just for the human or animal alone, especially for zoonotic diseases, but for both. So I saw these interesting reports by some analysts in Chatham House talking about the importance of, actually establishing human and animal vaccines to combat antimicrobial resistance. And I think this is where we need to reach, because when we look at the problem of infectious disease in the first place, many of these infectious diseases are zoonotic, and then we also have them affecting human and animals alike. So why can't we have vaccines to actually combat both humans and animals together? So this is where I think that, we need to be targeting as researchers in the field. And what are the benefits of vaccines in tackling AMR? Apart from the ones I've mentioned, it leads to a decrease in drug-resistant infection and associated treatment failure. And obviously, it leads to reduction in antimicrobial use, because most of the reasons why people use antimicrobials in the first place, especially when they misuse it, many of the conditions they have can be people, for example, in Nigeria, people have common colds and then they take antimicrobials. So we could also reduce healthcare and economic burden from hard to treat infections as well. And I'd like to show some of the work, that MRN members have done in these topics of vaccinology and antimicrobial resistance. There was this work I did with other scientists where we talked about the importance of, Africa to develop vaccinology as a means of curbing antimicrobial resistance. And there are so many reports by the African CDC now, to start vaccine manufacturing in Africa, which I think is a step in the right direction. And we also conducted this review article, 2 review articles actually, that was published on tropical disease, travel medicine, and vaccines, talking about the landscape of malaria vaccine candidates in pipeline. And now we have 2 malaria vaccines, RTSS and R21, which are actually relevant to, to combat antimicrobial resistance, because there are several reports that the anti-malaria in Africa are not working as they should anymore. So with these vaccines, they could actually reduce the use of anti-malarials, and also the need to increase antimicrobial resistance surveillance among forcibly displaced persons as well. In conclusion, vaccines are very key to reduce the spread of infection and also to prevent the need for antibiotics. And by decreasing antibiotic use, vaccines can help to mitigate the development of antimicrobial resistance. And we need to consider the One Health approach, right, in vaccinology as well. I think they work hand in hand. And targeted vaccination strategies can actually reduce the burden of AMR in both humans and animals. And we need to start integrating vaccines into AMR strategies if we want to consider a sustainable and long-term solution to combat resistance globally. I would like to acknowledge MRN, most especially Dr. Mona for the work she's doing with MRN and for inviting me to speak at today's webinar. And appreciation to all the institutions I've learned from, University of Ilorin and my an institution from my recently completed master's in vaccinology as well. These are my references. Thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions if they are available.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mr. Iyiola. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And you touched on a very, very interesting subject across the discussion this evening. I do have a couple questions, definitely. For one, I have a question on AMR because I've also delved a little bit into the space of antimicrobial resistance, and I've tried to approach AMR from an ethical perspective. And also there's been several conversations regarding vaccines, the safety of vaccines, and the different innuendos surrounding how the use of vaccines in different parts of the world has actually been spoken about. We may not be able to conclusively decide as to what the burden of truth or otherwise is. But my first question this evening would be that you've been in the West, you've traveled to different countries in Europe, you've studied in some of the leading institutions, and you've also had the opportunity of studying very particularly vaccinology, which is one of the crux of this evening's conversation. But you grew up in Nigeria, right, which could be representative of sub-Saharan Africa. I recall recently reading the Lancet report on AMR, and one of the things I noticed from that report is the fact that the burden, the mortality attributable and associated death due to antimicrobial resistance that was reported for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole was quite very little. I think the number stood at a measly 40,000 deaths combined, both Central Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Sub-Saharan Africa, and Western Sub-Saharan Africa was at around 40,000 to 100,000 deaths attributable and associated. Whereas when you look at Europe, it was somewhere around 2 million associated attributable deaths. And if you look into the Oceania and Southeast Asia, it was close to also, it was in millions. And Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa had numbers well below 200,000. And that led me to think, or to begin to think, that there's an underreporting of the burden of death attributable and associated with AMR in Africa. And that leads me to the question this evening. Do you think that we as a people, Africa as a whole, do we have the luxury of pandering the same narratives that we often hear in the West? You know, in Europe, I've heard people say, I'm an anti-vaxxer, and I don't believe in vaccines. And I would never believe in vaccines, and none of my children would use vaccines. And it's worked for some of them. But looking at the health system in Africa, you come from Nigeria, you know what our health sector looks like. In all humility, right, and without intention to disparage, do you think we have the luxury of also beating a similar drum to say we don't need vaccines in Africa because of the possible harm it might actually portend? And so what would you say from a professional perspective? Do we just go along with that story and say, oh, if the West do not want vaccines, Africa also should not want vaccines? Or do you think that our case may be different considering the context of our health systems?
So thank you for your question, and thanks for your input as well. So I would just like to start from, mentioning that there's a very high assurance that when a vaccine gets to the market, it is safe and efficacious and efficient for what it is designed for. And that is because, before vaccines gets to the market and before they even get incorporated into the immunization schedule of a particular country, they've undergone series of testing, and these testing are usually in, both preclinical and clinical. And, the process of vaccine development, over these past years have been very, 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 it takes a long time. It has just been streamlined recently with evidence as well. So vaccines, firstly, goes through preclinical testing, then it goes through several phases of clinical testing, phase 1 clinical trial, phase 2, phase 3. And even after they get to the market, they still post, market surveillance that is being carried out. And the importance of this is just to assess the safety and risk of these vaccines. So just like any other, medications used, vaccines do have side effects, right? But what scientists will then consider is, and the purpose of this, this testing is to be able to ascertain which side effects these, vaccines have. So they are broadly classified into adverse events and severe adverse events. Adverse events are basically, that side effect that would not necessarily cause any big harm to the individual. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because when, all these things are being done and we get the comprehensive data from it, what scientists and what regulators as well would consider, we have the FAO, we have, we have the US FDA in the United States, and we have the AMR in Europe. What they consider is, does the data that we have, does the benefits outweigh the risk, right? So, and when we look at it, vaccines, after, safe access to, water, clean water, vaccines are the next, are the next, benefit to humans after water, after clean water. And we've seen the evidence of that, without conducting any research. We've seen how vaccines have eradicated diseases like polio, for example. Recently, we've seen how it's brought us out of the pandemic, for COVID-19 pandemic. So, when we have these minor reports of the side effects that, that people have, which people have side effects with using medications as well, vaccines are generally safe, right? And the reasons why we have anti-vaxxers, I've seen a lot of anti-vaxxer sentiments. And in my own opinion, I think they are mostly, they are politically inclined, they are politically agitated. Because when you look at Africa, I can speak for Nigeria for myself. People are not, people are generally not hesitant to receive vaccines, especially because, they've seen how this helps, the community. For example, before now, we've seen like children under 5, how under 5 mortality, leads to death. In the past, this is why in many African countries, we used to have like, nuclear family with 12 children because they want to assume that maybe 10 of them would die and would have 2, that would survive. We've seen cases of this in the past. But now families can conveniently have 1 children they can choose to have. And this is because of the, routine immunization that we have. Now, I'm not saying that vaccine hesitancy does not happen in Africa, especially with, advent of fake news and reports. But the reason why I think we have in Europe, compared to Africa, why we have anti-vaxxers is because, number one, I think they are politically inclined. And number 2, I also think it's because, people don't see the benefit of vaccines, really. And, if one would tell me to come take vaccine, if I'm not a vaccinologist, my first concern would be, why should I take it? I'm not sick. But let's say I'm sick, I have malaria. No one would even tell me before I start asking for anti-malaria drug, right? So because of that disparity, vaccines are given before, they are given to protect you. So people then choose to say, it's my health, I don't want vaccines, I won't get sick. But you don't know if you will get sick. We have, like, for example, HPV vaccines that prevent cervical cancer being rolled out currently. And people are saying that, they don't want their girls to get it because they would probably not get HPV. But the thing is, you can't really detect, transmission of diseases by saying you won't get it. And when you have these vaccines, it can protect you against, the deadliness of these diseases. So to answer your question, I don't think it would be right for us to, have in Africa that won't have vaccines. And that's because what you just mentioned, the statistics you mentioned, I think if we are saying that the rate of, and I think that's what I got from your statistics, that the rate of antimicrobial resistance deaths are lesser compared to Europe, right? So this is obviously due to underreporting because I feel like when we look at all other, standards, especially hygienic standards, right? The rate of infection in Europe, like cholera, typhoid, is very low. It's very minimal compared to Africa, right? So why should then the rate of resistance be higher in Europe? And in Europe, there's good health system, there's universal health coverage. So data is being reported in real time. But in Africa, I could have malaria without going to hospital. If I subscribe to using Agbo, So, and I could also get, these antimicrobials that are over the counter, right?
Yeah.
Which is not over the counter in Europe. Yeah, but I could get that. So obviously the number is severely underreported, right? So, and because we still have problems with WASH, that's water, sanitation, and hygiene, when vaccines come, we actually need to, to adopt the use of vaccines because they are safe and efficacious. And, in answering this question myself, this is why I study vaccinology. And I think I've been able to see the light that vaccines are actually very safe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Iyiola. Before I pass it on to other members in the room to ask their question, I would also want to touch on something, which is the ethics of maybe antimicrobial resistance, the ethical conversations revolving around antimicrobial resistance. And one of these is the ease of access to therapy. So some people would tell you that, yes, it is very right what you see in Europe, that people should not have easy access to antibiotics or all kind of medication that could be antimicrobial, and that this should be prescribed specifically by a doctor. But then I tend to think on the flip side, something happened. I had gastroenteritis. I think it's been about a year or so, or almost 2 years now. And the symptoms were quite obvious. I knew that this was gastroenteritis. And I went to a pharmacy. For one, it was at the dead of the night. The transport network here is not 24 hours transport system. So there was no way I could get down unless I wanted to Uber myself down to the general hospital. I was not in a very good health condition to be able to even use my phone or anything. I struggled. There was this pharmacy just some 100 meters away from my place. And so I staggered all the way out and down to this place and explained the symptoms. The pharmacist acknowledged that, yes, these are symptoms of gastroenteritis, but because it's a microbial infection, he refused to sell me an antibiotic. He told me that the only way he could prescribe an antibiotic was if I came with a prescription. He also acknowledged the difficulty of getting down to the general hospital or to any other hospital in the vicinity to get a prescription at that time of the night. And that leads me to that question. What is the burden of, on the flip side, while we are trying to, increase awareness and set up systems that would actually control the use of antimicrobials or stewardship? What of the flip side? People who may not be able to get access, people in remote parts of Africa, in rural Africa, who may not have access to medical doctors in order to get prescription. If Africa was to roll out these kind of stewardship systems where people cannot get medications or certain antibiotics across the counter, don't you think that we might actually also be digging another grave for even more death as a result of the lack of access to antibiotics or antimicrobials? And taking into consideration the notoriety of some of our doctors. Some doctors might even begin to politicize or monetize prescription for these drugs. How do you think we can balance stewardship and that consciousness for health and safety of the people above and beyond systems?
Yes, thank you for your question. So really, I understand, the dilemma of not having antibiotics as over the counter in some developed countries. And if you would ask me, when we look at the healthcare in Europe and healthcare in Africa, it's starkly different, right? For one, there is no universal health coverage in Africa, right? And the second thing is there is also no access to healthcare in Africa. And I don't think it would be a smart idea for any African country, especially Nigeria, to make antimicrobials over the counter right now, if those two things are not, are not put in place: universal health coverage and access to healthcare. And the reason why I said this is because even though your case has happened that way, which is very unfortunate, I'm sorry about that. I feel like the reason why it is there is because, to give checks and balance. Antibiotics are very useful, right? But they are more useful when we don't use them blindly. So I feel, I'm of the strong opinion that it should still be over the counter in developed countries because there's access to healthcare. You could easily go to the hospital, get relevant diagnosis, and then get prescription for what is wrong, so as to safeguard antibiotics. And the necessity of safeguarding antibiotics is because we still need them for people that critically needs them. People like, cancer patients. We also have like immunocompromised patients that are very susceptible to, secondary bacterial infection. So we can keep that, for them, especially because they are now increasing rates of cancer and all these things. I think that necessitates the importance of keeping, antibiotics in check. But the flip side, I wouldn't say that for, African countries. We still need these antibiotics, especially because, for example, people still use vet attendants for delivery and all these things, and they need these resources. They need all these things to also use for their services because we don't have access to healthcare. So I would just say that when we consider all of these policies, it should be in line with what is available for the country. So it should be a case by case and not just generally recommended. We should have antibiotics over the counter is a good idea, but is it a good idea for any African country currently? So that's what should be discussed, and then this should be what we should strive for after putting all other things in check. So that's my opinion about that.
Thank you
and I
very
hope
much.
I was able to answer your question.
Yes, I very much appreciate your answer. And I think that's very beautiful. That's very right. It has to be on a very specific person by person or nation by nation analysis. The one approach would not fit all. And so each country or each region should have specific strategies that takes into consideration the demographics of their own particular people and how best to tackle the problem of antimicrobial resistance. Let's hear from Dr. Mona and Yusuf.
Okay, so greetings and thank you so much, Iyiola. This was very informative. I really like the slides and all the references. It was really deep exploration into the idea of antimicrobial resistance, and then slowly you took us to the One Health vaccines. Although I would like that you shed also light on the types of vaccines, because as you know, this is also important. We have live vaccines or inactivated vaccines, killed vaccines, subunit conjugate vaccines. We have several types, and even in the paper that we wrote on malaria vaccines, we elaborated more on even the mRNA vaccines. So from the standpoint of my background as a medical doctor, I would like to delve into two ideas. First of all, the immunological, and also the ecological impact of these One Health vaccine proposals. So the immune system actually is not just it's like a warfare that's composed of release of B cells, T cells, and the interplay happens. Actually, it involves the microbiota. And this is in all species, by the way. So from the standpoint that I'm a parasitologist, we also have a microbiota in mosquitoes. We have microbiota in the parasites themselves, not just in the human beings. So the functional role of the microbiota is to maintain the immune balance within any host. And this represents 95% of the immune system in any host. So this is very difficult to tackle, by the way. And also what I'm afraid of is the bacterial overgrowth. So we have in all these kind of species, it's like a big zoo, so you have something virulent and you have beside it something that's opportunistic. So I'm afraid that this imbalance inside the species, this would disrupt the immunological response on the long run and even will make the pathogen evolve in a very unusual way. Something else about the herd immunity. And this is something that runs in the communities, when you give a vaccine, you have a herd immunity. And by this, I mean what about in wildlife? For example, you mentioned that animals should also be vaccinated with the same type of vaccine, just like humans, and anything else that has the same pathogen. So this is something that's query for me, because what about the herd immunity? And even you have subspecies from any pathogen. And I can tell even for mosquitoes, for example, we have 2,000 something species of mosquitoes. So it's very difficult to tackle all this. And also something else about the reproductive system of all these, like human, animal, and so on. The reproductive system is deeply affected by the adjuvants incorporated in any vaccine. The adjuvant could include like aluminum particles. It may include like hepatitis B surface antigen, also to facilitate the viral capacity. So we have a very sophisticated mechanism that can affect the stability of the internal ecosystem in any host. So this is something that really worries me, that loss of this natural immune response would be altered. Something else about the ecological impact. So if we are mentioning about the One Health vaccines and its effect on the biodiversity, what about the ecological balance after all? So I think this contradicts the ideas of planetary health, because in planetary health, we are putting a lot of emphasis on the biodiversity conservation. And so these unintended ecological consequences we should put in consideration, beside the interaction between the host and the pathogen, or and the host and animals, and this can have like cascading effects. New strains can emerge. So I have a lot of concerns, and this is added to what Samuel mentioned. So I think we need to step back and see the bigger picture of the immune system in all species, because it's very sophisticated, and subhanallah, this is really one of the mysteries of how the immune system function. And so I have a lot of concerns about the idea of vaccination in general, because sometimes the place, it needs just like infrastructure. The community need infrastructure to curb any environmental conditions. And for example, in Egypt, we recently took this certificate of elimination of malaria, and this was purely like vector control, purely vector control. We didn't apply any vaccination even as trials, And by the way, to speak only of the population of Sudanese inhabiting Egypt now, is like 15 million. So you can imagine the number of migrants to Egypt in these past 10 years because of the geopolitical circumstances we are living. But at the same time, due to strict vector control, the infection was curbed. With this, I mean like no new indigenous cases was discovered in the past 7 years. So with this, I would like that, we try to delve more into the depth of the sophisticated immune system and the sophistication of the whole ecological balance. And it's a nice way to approach antimicrobial resistance. And also we can hear the perspectives from our epidemiologist, Yusuf, and the pharmacologist, or the pharmacist, Habibullah, who can also, dive deeper into these facets as epidemiology and as drug formation. So maybe Yusuf or Habib can jump in to broaden our perspectives on this issue of vaccines.
Okay. Good evening from Nigeria, and well done for that insightful presentation, Iyiola. So I was going to ask so many questions because the presentation was actually so interesting, to be honest. So, but then I think Samuel has asked some of the questions that I would want to ask, and even Dr. Mona even mentioned something concerning the implementation complexity. You mentioned the vaccine as one of the most sustainable prevention to address the risk of AMR. So I was going to ask a question on considering the technical complexity of we coordinating across the the human health, the animal health, and the environmental sector. I mean, the human, animal, and environmental health. Like, how are we addressing the potential for the vaccine that you mentioned, that's the intervention, in one sector without creating unintended consequences in another sector? So that is where ethics come in. And I think Dr. Mona actually delve into that. So, well, mostly I actually have the main question I have now is actually your presentation actually argues for vaccine as AMR solution. And yes, the vaccinologists will always do that. So, but then I'm particularly interested as a public health scientist. I'm actually interested in the implementation science within the context for Nigeria. So, considering our complex public health system in the country, where we have the parallel vaccination systems, we are dealing with the issue of out of pocket healthcare expenditure, and then the issue of all these informal drug supply chain. So, what do you think, or how do you think we can best measure the real world impact of vaccine administration on AMR reduction? So,
So
all right, okay.
yeah, thank you for your question. So I wouldn't say I know a lot about vaccine, administration in Nigeria, for example, because I've not had the opportunity to work on vaccination in Nigeria. But from a standpoint of, being a Nigerian and understanding what is obtainable in Nigeria, we've actually seen, for example, interventions that have led to reduction in under 5 mortality in Nigeria. For example, like the mass distribution of azithromycin. And while I feel like, is this really ethical? This is like distributing antimicrobials on a large scale among under 5, children, which I feel could, also affect their microbiota. And when we talk about microbiota disruption, I think it's a bigger problem with the use of antibiotics than vaccines. And then, but epidemiologists and public health scientists are seeing the impact, even though I've not seen any good explanation on how this mass distribution leads to the reduction of death in under 5 mortality, especially in northern Nigeria. So I feel like, we've already seen a very good evidence, right, of how vaccines actually prevent infection with the routine immunization schedule that we have, right? We've seen that when, we have children right from birth, they start administering vaccines to them to prevent serious disease like hepatitis, and through their childhood till toddler age, they continue to get vaccine being administered to them. And this is possible through the immunization schedule that we have. These vaccines are free, provided by the government via supra-international organizations like Gavi and UNICEF. And we already have good evidence that suggests that these vaccines can curb effectively, these diseases that have serious impact in childhood. I think using the same strategy to evaluate the effectiveness of the importance of childhood immunization, we could also see how that could possibly impact vaccines against AMR. And already the the right adoption of vaccines, we've seen how that helps to prevent needless use of antimicrobials, right? Look at, for example, when COVID-19 pandemic came and some Nigerians became vaccine hesitant, and that's always the problem with vaccines, right? We know in the case of medications that we have paracetamol, we have flagyl. Even among antibiotics, we know they are different, right? We have flagyl, which is metronidazole, we have azithromycin, we have a lot of them, and they have names. But vaccines do not explicitly have different names. Vaccines are vaccines, but vaccines are not actually vaccines. Vaccines are designed for different pathogens, and COVID-19 vaccine is different from diphtheria vaccine, for example. But then people don't understand this. People don't understand that vaccines are different, right? When they just hear, they hear vaccines, right? And we've seen that due to the vaccine hesitancy that occurred as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, we started having rise of cases in vaccine-preventable diseases in Africa. Nigeria was reporting diphtheria cases like sometimes around last year or early this year, there was rise in diphtheria. And this is vaccine preventable. This is another evidence that suggests, the effectiveness of vaccines. When things were normal, we're not seeing diphtheria cases in the country. But then as a result of vaccine hesitancy, it started coming up. So, and I want to address one more thing that Dr. Mona said. During the COVID-19, right, researches were being carried out in real time. And one of the research that I actually read was to assess, the impact of COVID-19 vaccines on fertility in women. And, the study, I can share it later, but the study concluded that, COVID-19 vaccine did not have any impact in women. I'll share the study, and I feel like one thing that I like about the field of vaccinology is that there is always the need to gather evidence, especially to address the concerns, the safety concerns that people have. And if a vaccine, even after post-market authorization is detected to have a risk to public health, it will be withdrawn. And we don't often have these cases of withdrawing vaccines, even compared to drugs, right? Because before vaccines get to the market, they are tested, like effectively tested. And the reason why I argue for, the public health intervention of vaccines strongly is because, in real time, within short time, I mentioned the example of diphtheria. We are seeing how vaccines are really impacting, people. Now, there are so many risks that often stems from anti-vaxxer sentiments. And I want to emphasize that being an anti-vaxxer is different from being vaccine hesitant. Anti-vaxxers are strong believers that vaccines are risky, are dangerous, and they often don't come from a point of knowledge. They come from political and economic motives, and they are peddlers of fake news. That's it. But people are vaccine hesitant because they don't understand the information surrounding vaccines and because they are most often influenced by anti-vaxxer sentiments, right? And when you tell them the importance and relevance of these vaccines, they get it. And in recent times, we've seen vaccine rollouts in Africa, especially Nigeria. But before now, we've had vaccine rollouts in Europe, for example, in France. And there are epidemiological studies that have, shown the evidence that this has reduced cervical cancer in women. And then we are currently having a surge in cervical cancer in women in Nigeria, in Africa. These are already evidence, real-world evidence to show the relevance of vaccines. They don't have to tell us they don't have to tell us that some things are risky. We as healthcare professionals can also see it in real time, right? And not just as healthcare professionals, but as normal people, right? I've seen I believed in COVID-19, for example. I believed that COVID-19 was real. I knew it was a big risk, but it didn't make sense. I could not conceptualize the risk until I lost a family member to COVID, right? And recently, cervical cancer has been mentioned several times. I didn't know it was a huge risk until I had a friend that had cervical cancer. Even though I was advocating for HPV vaccines before then, my voice became more, more loud because now I have someone that has been affected by it. So when we have, these tools that are aimed at helping us, and vaccines are not like, solutions to everything. Of course, we still need to advocate for other public health interventions like vector control to control, malaria and other vector-borne diseases. We need this. We need to advocate for access to safe water. We need to do all these things. But in complex places like Nigeria, where there is still like, the government is not really investing in these things, do we then say, oh, if governments would not, I've seen arguments that says, instead of providing vaccines, why can't they provide good access to water and all these things? Infrastructure are very, very difficult to achieve, very expensive to, to come about. What I just believe is that all these things needs to work hand in hand, right? We need this infrastructure to be put in place, but also need vaccines, to prevent infection. So I'm not sure if I was able to address, all of these questions and concerns, but I know the science, the social science behind vaccines, especially the communication, is always very complex. People have concerns, but scientists also have concerns because you must also understand that scientists are humans and they are not just doing this for for the people, but for also themselves. So as much as people have concerns, we have our own concerns, and we are really doing the work to be able to assess these concerns if they are, as I mentioned, if the benefits actually, if the benefit outweigh the risk or otherwise. I hope
Thank you.
I was able to
Thank you.
address
Yes,
this.
this was
Yeah.
elaborative, and I really like that you speak your heart. And also, as usual, any vaccine, it need like clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, 3. So this goes without saying. So because of the time, I would like also to hear from Abimbola, if you have anything to contribute with, any question. And after that, we will make the conclusion and then wrap up our meeting. So
Yeah.
Habib.
Good evening, everyone. I'm currently on transit, and I'm so sorry. I dropped my message on the chat box just now, earlier. So it was a wonderful presentation. So thanks so much. And I am on transit. Please kindly check the chat box
for the comprehensive question.
Yeah. So Habib mentioned on the chat that he had the privilege of working on Parkinson's disease during his thesis. And with regards to the importance of genomic and microbiome data in advancing personalized medicine. So he said, however, there is a data deficit from Africa, which limits global applicability in this regard. This simply indicates that drug produced for African populations will arguably be less effective compared to European population. Given that AMR is a global challenge, how do you think we can address the issue of lack of data and production of vaccines and other drugs by global north for African population, especially given the potential of vaccines in addressing the issue of antimicrobial resistance in Africa? So I think that, yes, data has always been the issue with, Africa. There's lack of data. And I also believe that this is as a result of poor, funding of sciences, especially in healthcare, in medical sciences in general. And this is why one of the, most important ways to address the issue, of antimicrobial resistance is surveillance. We need surveillance data from every sector, from the human health sector. We need to know the use of antimicrobials in animals. There was a report by Oxford University recently, together with some scientists in Nigeria, where they reported colistin resistance in newborn. colistin resistance in newborn, like that is unbelievable. And that is a result of the use of colistin for agriculture. Meanwhile, colistin has been banned in some other countries, like China. The use of colistin in agriculture has been banned. And we are having these cases, in newborn. And this also shows the connectedness between environmental health and human health. Shows the transmission of AMR pathogens across these fields. So, and in aspect of personalized medicine, I feel like this is not, this is one of the beauty of, vaccine testing, clinical trials. Currently, phase 2 clinical trials of Lassa fever is happening in Nigeria. And the importance of clinical trial is to be able to test these vaccines across different populations that would need the vaccine. The phase 1 trial has been done among elderly individuals in a different country. And the importance of phase 1 trial in elderly individuals is to test that this vaccine, is to test the safety of the vaccine. So we are giving elderly individuals, about 10 elderly individuals, this vaccine. How do they respond to it? And they look at this data and they're able to confirm if this vaccine is safe enough to go to phase 2 trial. And then the phase 2 trial is tested on the target population among volunteers, and in large number. So if the phase 1 is done among tens of individuals, phase 2 will be done among hundreds of individuals. And when it is being tested in Nigeria currently, Nigeria has one of the largest burden of Lassa fever. If it passes phase 2 trial to phase 3, which obviously would also be conducted in Nigeria, then we can guarantee that this vaccine will be safe and efficacious for the Nigerian population and West African population at large, right? So I feel like the testing of, vaccine has already incorporated the issue of, personalization. And a lot of research, especially in vaccinology, is, multidisciplinary, and not just multidisciplinary, but also like very collaborative in recent times. So the issue of drugs, the development of drugs is different from vaccines generally. So I don't think that would necessarily be a problem. The problem with the Parkinson's disease lack of data is, I don't think that's a problem with regards to vaccine development. But of course, we still need data in Africa, in all sectors, in fact. And then he asked, how do we address the limited expertise in the area of vaccinologists, scientists in Africa, given the burden of various infectious diseases? Well, this is where one of the ways we should address, limited expertise is, number one, we need, technical capacity building. Firstly, I even think before that, we need to attract in Africa, we need to attract, the best brains. I've met a lot of, vaccinologists from African descent. In my class, for example, we had, about 5 people from Africa among the 23 of us, 6, from Ghana, from Egypt, from Uganda. And, right now, many of us are scattered around the world, but not in Africa. You understand? And that's because the problem is that we don't have the institution to work in Africa. So we need to institutionalize, Africa with regards to vaccine development. And there are various, market opportunities there. So we need to attract the brains to come back home and, contribute their quota to the development of vaccine. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to create, the resources for them. So when we talk about vaccines, it requires investments. And the problem we have is that many of the vaccines that we even get in Africa are not fully acquired by the government. The government is contributing little to it. Most of it are, done by mechanisms of Gavi and UNICEF. They are the ones helping, countries like Nigeria and other low and middle income countries to acquire their vaccines. So for once, like for a fact, we don't even have sufficient investment in our health sector. Then how can we have investments in sectors like vaccinology and all these things? So, but we have organizations like Africa CDC that is clamoring for vaccine manufacturing. We have some recent development that looks promising, but I think we need to attract the best brains back home because we actually have lots of, African scientists that are very good in various fields of vaccinology. I don't think lack of manpower is a problem. I don't think so. The second thing is we need to, develop the capacity in our home country as well in terms of institution. And the third thing is we need to start incorporating these things into our education. We need to make our education system better, more interdisciplinary as well, to support training in vaccinology. So these are some of the things I can think over my head right now.
That's very nice, Iyiola, and even you are one of the finest minds, you are really unique, and I really like that you try to analyze and try to see everything, how it relates from near or far. So this is the quality of a good scientist, and you are really one of them. So I'm truly honored to be with you in this MRN space discussing about the work that you have been doing and advocating for within the vaccinology field. And as you mentioned, we need sovereignty within the African continent to bring back home all the brilliant minds and even to be able to make the vaccines with our own hands in our own institutions. This is something very important because we do understand our communities better and our atmosphere, So with this, I would like to hear Samuel for final closure of this meeting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mona.
Truly welcome, Iyiola. So Samuel, are you there? Yusuf, do you have anything else as a final thought?
Oh, not really. That was a powerful presentation, and I like the way Iyiola addressed some of the questions thrown at him. So that's very wonderful and nice presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, I echo what you said, Yusuf, and we will continue researching and doing our collaborative work within the MRN and beyond. So with this, I would like to highlight some of the research ideas that maybe was within what you mentioned, Iyiola, for us to stimulate this kind of research ideas. Maybe we can try to dive into what Abimbola mentioned about the personalized approach and the clinical trials. Is it sort of, synchronizing with this approach? And also about the One Health approach and the diversity issue. And also about the societal acceptance of these kinds of human interventions. We also need to dive deeper into this. And finally, the ecological impact, that you have mentioned also, how this is, pro or against the ecological balance, that we don't intend to disrupt it after all. So anything else to add on, Iyiola, before we close this meeting?
I just want to appreciate once again for inviting me. And truly, MRN has always been a very good platform to discuss science and public health in Africa. And I believe that this would also be an opportunity for continuous discussion in the field of vaccinology, which is really, really important field that we should consider to discuss more in Africa, really. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank
and
you.
together, if you just scan the screen now, you can see like a vaccinologist and microbiologist, which is you, Iyiola, We have also an epidemiologist, which is Yusuf, and we have an exposome scientist, Samuel Abimbola, and myself interested in immunology. So we can further collaborate on this topic because it's very, very important, actually. And we need to be in the spotlight, diving deeper into these ideas. So with this, I would like to thank you once again, Iyiola, for accepting the invite and for sharing your profound knowledge with us. And thank you, Yusuf and Samuel, for facilitating this session. And until next time, take great care of you, and Assalamu alaikum.